prioritize the big stuff, and the big stuff is getting the crop off the field. That has to be number one, and then try and deal with straw and stubble cultivation and the catch crops after that. But we've limited resources on every farm, and I think for the moment, the advice from our end anyway should be like that, the big stuff is the crop.
July has been the wettest on record in many weather stations, with over 2.5 times the long-term average rainfall. In comparison to 2022, many stations have recorded over 4 times the rainfall. Soils are wet and harvest is behind on many farms. Farmers continue to snatch and grab crops where they can, but this isn't easy. Losses from shedding and lodging are compounded by high moistures, but every tonne in the shed is a tonne saved. You're listening to the latest episode of the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. We would really appreciate it if you could listen, follow and give us a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts from. The poor weather is expected to continue with no let up for the next few weeks, so it won't get any easier for the harvest. I'm delighted to be joined by Ciaran Collins, a Tillage Specialist in Teagasc, to discuss the harvest and other tasks which farmers need to complete over the next few weeks. Ciaran, it's been extremely difficult over the last few weeks to get the harvest completed. You might give us a bit of an update about where the harvest is at the moment.
As you say, it's been a really difficult time, really. I suppose initially the harvest started quite early. We had obviously that fine weather in June, and the start of July there, you saw a good bit of the winter barley harvested. But I was just looking at figures yesterday there from Met Éireann, and the likes of Moore Park, which would be close to me, the long-term average was 62 mils for July, and we had 150. And wetter in the northeast end, Dunsane, long-term average there 61 mils, and we've had 185. So that's 3 times the normal for July. So I suppose that's the nub of where we're at in terms of progress. Really, it's just been a real stop-start affair.
Wettest on record, I believe, Ciaran, according to Met Éireann yesterday.
It's it's really just disrupted the harvest, Michael. Really, that's the bottom line of it,
So, as you say, some of that winter barley started to be harvested about probably 3 weeks ago now, or more. Geez, maybe even a bit longer now. Was there much of that straw at all baled from that crop?
It was a bit of a smash and grab, really. So, as you say, there was actually we had June barley this year, which is very unusual. I suppose. Look, the majority of it was into the early days of July, but really, there's very little of that straw baled. I mean, farmers got in, they got stuff cut, but it was very difficult. You just weren't getting that second and third day that you needed to get the straw,
So that must look like a bit of a mess in the field now at this stage, is it?
Yeah, sure. Look, some of that stuff, as you say, is down with 4 weeks or more in some cases, and I suppose we'll probably be talking about straw later on, but I think a lot of farmers have just made the decision not to touch it really until the weather just comes right, that you're going to get a prolonged spell of weather together to manage that.
We might come back to that again in a few minutes, but just come back to the harvest again in terms of the other crops that are out there and probably ripe. Winter oilseed rape was certainly one that would be tricky if it was left in the field, for any distance past when it was really ripe.
Yeah, I mean, growers have made good enough progress with it. Again, as I say, this kind of, when you were getting those couple of fine days, like the area of oilseed rape is in around 20,000 hectares. And I suppose you can go from not much rape cut to quite a lot cut in a very short space of time when you do get those 2 or 3 days together, So I think there's been reasonable progress, certainly in rape. It's probably not all done, but I think there is good progress in it at this stage. In terms of yield, it's been quite variable. We came off the back of a season last year where most crops were in around the 2-ton mark, and it was absolutely fabulous year. But this year we are seeing some of those 2-ton crops, but a much wider variation. You're hearing some of those 1.6, 1.5 crops as well. So it's hard to get a handle on exactly why, but there certainly is quite a bit of variation in it. And
that's tons per acre, obviously, Ciaran.
Yeah.
I just heard just up this part of the world, and there's certainly most of the rape is actually cut, but there is a little bit of it still here and there. And I just heard a few people talking about the difficulty of getting contractors when you actually wanted to get them, because I mean, in fairness, most crops were pretty big, and you do need that side knife to be able to get in to cut them. So with such a small window, people were still waiting, I suppose, to get the right combine in to try and do the job. Was that a case down south at all?
Yeah, certainly. Look, as I say, it's just that the winter, I suppose, oilseed rape growers generally are fairly well equipped themselves. A lot of them, it's, I suppose, look, as you say, you need the side knife and that to cut it. But again, the area on farms sometimes wouldn't be huge, so they do. If you do get that window, you get through it. And I suppose, look, it was up to now, you were sort of hoping to get that moisture down around that 9-10 mark. At this stage, if there's rape to be cut, you're certainly going to take it at higher moisture to get it, because you will get shedding and lodging losses from now on, obviously.
And was there much shedding, Ciaran, around the country from rape?
No, I don't think so. Not huge. I suppose we're kind of fortunate enough that pod shatter resistance is built into a lot of the main varieties now, so they can withstand fair bits of weather, and certainly, but once crops get overripe, you are going to get seed losses, and I suppose it's those later ones where the losses would have been.
And moving on then to spring oats, being the other one that was fairly well ripe, there's certainly progress been made up this part of the world. How is it looking across the country, do you think?
Yeah, I think winter oats has done reasonably well. I suppose just talking to advisors there in the last few days, I think, again, a little bit of variation in it, but I think 3.5 ton per acre seems to be a quite common, I think quality has been quite good as well. So again, it's certainly not all cut, but I think there's been good progress in the last cutting window anyway, Michael, yeah.
Okay, and the other one I suppose that was up for the going. We probably two other ones. Spring barley, I think the earliest part of that has started, but there was also a little bit of winter wheat, I think, harvested as well.
Yeah, just on the wheat first. There certainly was. And again, quite a bit of variation again. Now it'd be a bit early to cast judgment on winter wheat, because there's obviously the majority is to be cut, but like the early reports seem to be a lot of crops in around the 4. But the variation really due to the better crops, where following maybe a break crop like beans or oilseed rape, where you had ditch to ditch. In other words, that you didn't have any, field losses, where you had bare patches due to waterlogging last winter. And on the flip side of that, some of the lower yields then coming from where you had those missing bits in fields, and maybe not a favourable rotation, but probably early enough yet to be trying to put an overall figure on it. But certainly I think the better crops seem to be yielding okay, in fairness.
Okay, yeah, well that's good. And the spring barley, there was a nice quantity of spring barley planted somewhere in late February, early March direction. Some of that's been harvested over the last while.
Some of that is done, yeah. You have a huge variation in spring barley in terms of ripening. I think, as you say, you had that late February, early March. There was some of those, particularly in kind of the likes of East Cork, maybe North Wexford, those kind of traditional spring barley areas. And then obviously we had later planting around Easter and then later into the end of April. But those early ones, growers did get into those in the last couple of cutting windows. I suppose there's two things about them really. A lot of them are in around the 3 ton and a shade with it, which is good. However, those crops last year were probably doing 3.5 ton and north of it. Do you know what I mean? So I think that's just maybe the year thing there. And I suppose the other kind of maybe thing to watch out for is they did look to be the best crops all year. So I suppose that's maybe a signal of where spring barley is possibly going this year. A lot of those earlier ones as well would have been for malting, because they would have been in those kind of traditional malting areas. And I think the signal I'm getting so far is that most of them have passed. However, I think proteins are quite low. So KPH has been okay, the moistures have been of what's cut has been okay, but proteins quite low.
And I heard up this part of the world, Ciaran, that some of the proteins were kind of distilling proteins, so they're actually very low in terms of, down under that 8.8 mark. So but look, there's a lot of crops to go, and the chances are with the lower yielding crops, they'll probably that the proteins will probably creep up quite a bit and quite quickly in those. Just thinking about those, some of those existing crops of barley that's out there, Ciaran, there seems to be a lot of green growth, secondary growth. I don't know what it maybe is, even third growth coming into some of these spring barleys. Are you seeing much of that down around your part of the world?
Yeah, certainly it's going to be a big issue going forward, and especially for malting, because if you're going to get green grains in a sample, it's going to result in failures. But look, it's an issue for everyone, for feed barley growers as well. I suppose we have a bit of history here in, like I remember in 2020, it certainly was a big issue, especially in tram lines, and 2018 as well, which was a very unusual year. Now, 2018, the summer came so good that probably a lot of that stuff ripened in and actually turned into being helpful in terms of yield. 2020, it was certainly more difficult to manage. So it's out there. There's plenty of it in fields. You can see it at the moment, and that's going to cause certainly harvesting difficulties, and especially in terms of for malting barley.
I suppose there might be even two different, just looking at some crops up around here, Ciaran, there might be a couple of different types of green grains in it. Some of it is has come a while back and it's reasonably well filled out, which may well end up in the green grains. But then there's some of the very later stuff that actually came through in crops, and maybe even some of the lodge crops. Very little in those, and the chances are they mightn't end up in the tank. They might end up out the back of the combine anyway. But nonetheless, it's all a bit of a worry. Is there anything a farmer can do if they're worried about it in terms of trying to get some of that over the weighbridge for malt and barley?
Oh, sure, it's really difficult. I mean, if you can, and this is theory and practice here are two different things, but like if you can avoid some of those patches in a field, and maybe if you've got a field to pick out a portion of the field that doesn't have a lot of green grains or secondary growth in it, and try and make a load or two loads of grain for malting barley, and in some way maybe leave the greener bits or cut them later, or certainly keep that bit for the feed heap. Maybe that's just some way, but it's really difficult to do anything other than that. Obviously you can't use glyphosate for ripening, or that's not allowed on the likes of malting barley and seed crops there as well. So I think, look, it's just sort of trying to pick and choose the right field really, or the right parts of a field for malting barley is about as much growers can do, Michael.
It's going to be a very difficult year to finish up, I think, Ciaran. It's not going to be easy in that. But talking about finishing up, there's the nitrates rules, of which people were getting used to last year, which stated that all fields needed to be stubble cultivated if they were going to spring crops within 14 days of harvest. That has changed, I think, over the last week or so, has it?
Yeah, the department there, and I suppose in fairness, it was always part of the regulation that, if there were weather issues, that, there could be amendments to that, and they have done that in fairness. So that 14 days now has been extended out to 28 days, So I suppose, look, that gives growers a little bit of leeway there. In terms of stubble cultivation,
But it doesn't. There's no exemption in terms of not doing it at all, apart from the 80%, only cultivating 80% and having 20% left for the birds if everything's going to the spring.
Yeah, and that will be reviewed. So that 28 days will take you out to the 1st of September, and then I suppose the department can review it again and see if further amendments are needed. So as we stand today, that stubble cultivation is out to 28 days.
Okay, but it's obviously very tricky. I know certainly up here, it's probably, I don't know, put another half an inch of rain probably up here again in Carlow last night, or all the way up till this morning. Ground is very wet. Is there a best way? I mean, should farmers actually be avoiding soils at the moment for as long as they can until see if they can get it to dry out? Or what's the best advice for that?
Oh, yes, certainly. I think, if my own view of it is, look, you can't stubble cultivate and wet conditions. That's just a no. Nothing is going to grow, and you're just going to have a mess there, and that's not what anybody wants. It damages soil structure. So I think in my own view is to try and plan it as best you can. So there's 20 to 25% of your area that you do not need to stubble cultivate, because that's for seed eating birds. So I'd be trying to plan that, what area can I dedicate to that if it is a requirement on the farm, because if you've all winter cereals, you obviously won't have that. So that's the first thing I'd be doing really, is trying to plan out that bit. Then have a look at where your winter cereals, where you're planning there to put those, and try and maybe prioritize then maybe the fields that you will need to do, and then when the opportunity comes, to try and do it then.
Yeah, and of course there's an added complication there where we mentioned straw earlier, where farmers have put in for the SIM scheme, or the straw incorporation measure scheme, and they will have to incorporate that straw at some stage into the soil. What would be the best advice there?
Oh, look, wait, absolutely wait until conditions are right. I think that just has to be the priority. And Michael, I also might say as well, like we've gone through a difficult month of July. The forecast as we sit here today isn't brilliant. And I think, to prioritize the big stuff, and the big stuff is getting the crop off the field. That has to be number one, and then try and deal with straw and stubble cultivation and the catch crops after that. But we've limited resources on every farm. And I think for the moment, I think the advice from our end anyway should be like that, the big stuff is the crop, that's where the money is financially and all of that. So try and deal with that. And then, try and, bit by bit, try and get through the stubble cultivation and dealing with the straw after that,
Just in terms of the straw, we chatted a little bit about the winter barley straw. Some of it's been on the ground now for nearly a month. I was only looking at a crop there this morning where you could actually see the volunteers growing within the sward and up through the sward. So swards are starting to green up, if you know what I mean. So there's bound to be a lot of losses off that, even if it hasn't been moved at all. What do you think farmers should do with that? I mean, the quality obviously has disintegrated in that. There's no two ways about it. But is there any best advice around that?
Oh, sure. There's nothing you can do only leave it. I mean, the worst thing you can do is turn it and then it gets wet again, So I think the only thing you can do there is just leave it. It's not, doesn't look well. It's all bleached on top and it's starting to get dirty underneath. But, it's just leave it there until there's a forecast where, you're going to get maybe a week of dry weather and try and handle it then. There's no point in doing that with it before then. And look, obviously, I know in the distilling industry, they talk about the angel share where you put, whiskey in a barrel and you lose whatever it is, a couple of percent of it every year. And it's the same with straw. I mean, if there was 10 bales to the acre, if it had been baled, when it was cut, you're certainly looking at lower yields at this stage. And that's something to keep in mind as well.
I suppose that might have a bit of an upside, Ciaran, in terms of the market, will it? From the point of view of, there's less winter barley out there this year. The straw that's there probably isn't going to be wonderful. There is less early sown spring barley with a lot of straw on that. There's a lot of later sown spring barley. We expect a lot less straw from that. And I suppose on top of that, we have a record amount of people putting in for straw incorporation. So do you think that should bode well then in terms of being a relatively good market for straw if we can manage to get it into a bale?
I think so. I certainly think so. I mean, if you look at the numbers, like the cereal area this year is down 6%, and as you said there's been a swing from winter barley to spring barley, which obviously reduces the number of bales of straw, and then we've had late sown barley, which obviously will have lower yield again. So that's a factor, and the other factor then is the sim area is up to. I think it's up to 70,000 overall. Probably is it 56 or 7,000 of that is cereals, and I think that's a 30% increase on last year. So all the factors are there that's kind of reducing the amount of straw that's going into the market. And look, some of that winter barley straw, as we just spoke about there a while ago, wherever it started, it's going to be less now. So look, the market should be strong. And I suppose the other thing is about it as well, when we have straw that we're trying to deal with in terms of turning it, like a lot of that might be, have to be scattered out maybe twice and raked in and baled. Like, I mean, there's a lot of additional cost there as well. So I think that's a factor as well that we shouldn't lose sight of, because the cost of making that bale is going to be a bit more than normal this year as well,
Yeah, and I suppose thinking about scattering out onto wet soil is probably not ideal either, because the majority of soils are probably at soil capacity, I suppose, in terms of water at this stage. Is there, are you seeing much? Because there's certainly a share of crops that are now lodged that are still due to be harvested. Is there any of that starting to germinate on the head, or any secondary growth kind of coming back up from that area that's needs to be, I suppose, thought about before we get to the harvest?
Early days to be talking about sprouting and things. No, haven't certainly seen that. The weather look is not favourable at the moment. But look, in terms of lodging, I suppose spring barley is probably the number one crop that you see around the place where we've got a lot of lodging. That early sown stuff was just probably a little bit more mature, and we've very little lodging in that. It's generally the later ones that we're seeing a bit of lodging in. Certainly a nice bit of lodging in winter wheat around the place as well. So look, that's a factor. And it's going to make it difficult, obviously, to harvest. We're going to need fine weather to get those crops.
So frustratingly enough, I suppose for every farmer, there is there's plenty of downtime in this harvest. There won't be much done today or tomorrow out in the fields, at least anyway. But I'm just thinking and projecting. I know we haven't got this harvest in, but next year is actually not that far away in terms of oilseed rape planting time. Should people be thinking about that at the moment, given the window is somewhere around maybe the second, third week in August, or maybe to the end of August?
I know it's odd to be talking about it when there's possibly a crop growing or straw in the field that would be destined for winter oilseed rape. But look, as you say, you can't beat a bit of planning. Have a look at the recommended list in terms of varieties, like the crew, to plan ahead, I suppose, really have everything lined up if that opportunity comes there at the end of August to get it in, that, just to have your soil test reports, what fertilizer you need, if you need any, if there's opportunities for organic manure, those kind of things. I suppose, just have it lined up if there's a bit of downtime at the moment. But as you say, it's kind of odd to be talking about it when we're still trying to remove crops in the field. But look, a bit of planning is going to make that job easier when it comes around. And look, oilseed rape has been good to growers in the last few years as well. So it's a crop that's very valuable in the system in its own right, but also from the rotational perspective as well, and the benefits that's bringing to the system. So not to forget about it, Michael, is true, yeah.
And Ciaran, is there any lessons that were learned from the 2023 season that can be brought across into next year in terms of choice of variety? Or we mentioned, I think earlier, around the pod shatter resistance. Is there one or two things that you were kind of bringing from last year into next year?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose we're all conscious of the cost of fertilizer, and like if you can get, like, the sowing date is crucial. Now look, that's weather dependent, but like you can see that last year and the year before, getting in there at the, dependent part of the country, we're in the middle and the back end of August, but getting that crop sown in August gives you a great opportunity because it builds biomass over the autumn period into the spring, and when you're doing your green area index measurements in the spring, you can save substantially on fertilizer, but it's the sowing date is probably the crucial part of that. And if there's an opportunity, we're seeing this every year, to put a bit of organic manure, oilseed rape is the best crop really that you can sow in the autumn to utilize organic manure. If there's an opportunity for that can result in significant savings, So I think sowing date probably, Michael, would be the biggest thing that I'd be kind of getting from, the last few seasons.
Keep it in August anyway. Don't let it slip to September, I suppose, would be the thing with it.
If it's possible, yeah. Certainly.
Okay, well, look, on that note, it's positive, I suppose, for next year, and hopefully farmers will have a chance to, and there'll be a bit of a break in the weather to try and get some of the backlog finished out. So Ciaran, thanks very much for your time again.
Oh, bother. Thanks, Michael.
Just to remind you again, a date for your diary is Friday, September the 8th, when we're having the Crops Forum in the Tillage Hotel in Naas. We will cover a number of topics this year, including new varieties, agronomy for the autumn, the new MAC or climate change model for tillage, and also a discussion forum with the tillage stakeholders around the future of the tillage industry. Finally, don't forget, if you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague, and as always, rate, review and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy, thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.